Hey guys, this is the Infernoman, and we do budget, jank, fun, and Magic the Gathering Arena. And today we're going to begin the first deck tech that I'm going to be doing. I'm going to try to put out there at least on every Tuesday, so I can at least dub this Deck Tech Tuesday, a deck tech of some kind of deck that I myself have actually played on Arena and have shown to be successful. Again, I don't have an actual flow to this, but I think the best way we're going to try to do this is we'll go over the deck first and the sideboard. We'll probably do maybe one or two demonstrations with Sparky just to show you again in the easiest way possible what the deck is trying to do. And if possible, we will also try to perform some upgrades to the deck off to the side in the deck actually has an applicable way to upgrade from the budget side. Now, before we begin, if you have any decks that you would like to see me play, I'm more than happy to hear you out. If you do have any questions or comments or concerns, be sure to hit me up on either here in the comments. You can also talk to me on the Twitter links. If I'm streaming, you can also hit me up there as well. I'll put all that stuff at the end of the video, and also I'll put it in the description below. So with that, let's go ahead, let's begin our first of many deck decks. And our deck today is going to be taking us to Historic, where we will be playing a budget burn deck, or as you want to sometimes say, mono red burn. The only difference with this version of the deck is we are actually going to be playing it without any rares or mythics. So that's what makes this one stand out from the others. If you are new to Arena, maybe a newer player, or maybe again you are playing on Arena but just have a bit of a budget where you can't afford to use a bunch of rares or mythics, this is a great deck to start with if you're just trying to build up your wins and slowly build a collection while you're also completing your dailies. So with that, let's go ahead. We're going to begin talking about the deck. Again, I'll go over first the deck itself, then talk about the sideboard. We will then probably play a couple of matches against Sparky just so that way I have time to actually explain what is going on as I'm playing it. And again, at the very end of the video, we will try to show you what are the possible upgrade paths with this style of deck. So let's go ahead. Now let's start talking about this deck. First, the creatures. So we have in the 1-drop slot the Get Through Lava Runner. You probably might have seen this before. Really simple. Just gets out on the field on turn 1. And as it says right here, as long as there are 2 or more instant or sorcery cards in your graveyard, the Lava Runner gets +1/+0 and has haste. Put it down on turn 1. Start swinging on turn 2. Hopefully, if you've thrown out a couple of burn spells, you should be able to then turn this on to make it a 2/2, and then it can start doing a little bit more chip damage. Again, not really meant to stick around for very long, but it gets in the early damage enough where then the rest of your spells can close it out. This is now where we talk about the 2-drop slot, and this is where things get interesting creature-wise. First off, the Pyromancer. Viashino Pyromancer does 2 damage when it enters the battlefield to either target player or planeswalker. Again, doesn't seem like it's doing much, but the sweet part about the card is at least it can do something once it hits the battlefield. Don't underestimate the fact that that 2 damage can also hit planeswalkers, so don't be afraid to do that if you absolutely need to finish off a planeswalker that may seem more threatening to your game plan than just throwing it to face. It may seem like it's really cut and dry, but again, depending on your circumstances, sometimes it may be better to get rid of the planeswalker. Other times you might have to ignore the planeswalker and go straight to face with the damage. Also, same thing like with the Lava Runner, you're going to have to chump block every so often, so don't be afraid to sacrifice this to prevent any damage going to you. Now, as for the other 2 cards, this is where things get a little spicy. First off, the Thermal Alchemist. Thermal Alchemist right here, it deals 1 damage to each opponent when you tap it. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you untap the Thermal Alchemist. This is a burn deck, so you're going to be throwing a lot of stuff at your opponent's face. So every time you do that, you'll be able to untap the Alchemist and do more damage. So think of it this way, when you're throwing around your Shock for 2 damage, then you can then tap the Thermal Alchemist while the Shock is on the stack, do 1 damage. Then your Shock will do 2 damage, untap the Thermal Alchemist, you can tap it again to do another. So your 1 Shock for the price of 1 mana can do possibly 4 damage with the help of the Alchemist. If your opponent does not get rid of the Alchemist early on, that damage will stack up very quickly. Also, there's a couple other cards I will mention when we get the spells as to where the Alchemist really helps out trigger off certain things that we're trying to do. Speaking of this and what it can trigger, Chandra's Pyreling is where things also get more fun. So this Elemental Lizard for 2 mana and a 1/3, whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, the Pyreling gets +1/+0 and gains double strike until end of turn. This does look harmless at first, but the more you are throwing direct burn damage to your opponent's face, the Pyreling will pump itself up for the turn and can swing in and do double striking damage. So that means you can be doing, instead of 1 damage, you could be doing 4 damage on a turn with 1 shock spell to the opponent's face. You can then double up from there. Also, keep in mind, this does synergize with the Thermal Alchemist. So if, say, like you're trying to block for just a turn with the Pyreling, you can tap your Thermal Alchemist, then have the Pyreling do the chump block, but because of double strike, it can finish off a cheaper creature if you need to in a pinch. So these two will really work together. Say like again, you are tapping and untapping a lot with the Thermal Alchemist as you're about to swing in with the Pyreling. This thing can close out a game in one turn sometimes if your opponent is not paying attention. So, as I mentioned, these cards, these two specifically, are going to be the critical ones you definitely want to keep on the field, because both of these cards are going to be what you need to help close out the game. All right, and with that, that's pretty much it for the creatures. Nothing too special here. The burn spells, let's go over and discuss what they're all about. And going over now the burn spells, if you've seen burn work, just keep in mind again, a lot of this is going to synergize off of what your creatures are trying to do. So it's important to know when to actually throw the burn at your opponent's face versus maybe getting rid of one of their creatures. But again, let's cover these real quick. So shock again is going to be 2 damage for 1 mana. Again, cut and dry. Throw to face most likely, but you can also use it in the early game to pick off creatures. At the same time, this also affects Spikefield Hazard, but Spikefield Hazard is interesting. So as you see, it does 1 damage to any target. If a permanent damage is dealt damage this way would die this turn, you exile it instead. This sometimes can be helpful if to throw this at, say, a Croaxa that was just thrown on the field, sometimes an Uro that comes out also on the field, and you can get rid of them permanently from the game. So just be aware of that in the early game when they're trying to throw out those creatures and are trying to ramp. Also, if you need it to be a land in a pinch, we can make it that way. I'll explain the land base in a bit and why this might be helpful. Going over to the 2-drop slot, we have Lightning Strike, same thing, 2 damage, 3 damage to any target. Cut and dry, use it where you feel is best. Flame of Keld is going to be our interesting pseudo card draw. So as you can see, when that comes into play, you have to discard your hand. But normally when you're playing burn, you're basically going to empty your hand very quickly. Only 2 are going to be needed in this deck, and the reason for that is we don't want to hold on to too many of these in case we need to save up burn spells before we throw this off. But however, if we do manage to put this on the field successfully, ideally what you're doing is discard your hand, which you probably would have no cards in your hand, draw 2 cards on the next turn, so you would have 3 cards in hand, and of course the finale of course is if a red source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player this turn, it deals that much damage plus 2 to that permanent or player instead. So this can help you finish out to close out games if you need to versus an opponent. This is going to be, again, triggering off of everything you have, not just the burn spells, but also, say, the Thermal Alchemist, and also things like the Pyreling. So this will stack up very, very quickly. And then finally, your 3-drop slot, where ideally none of these should be casted for their full value. Yeah, you should be able to cast them off for their secondary abilities, which we'll discuss right now. Wizard's Lightning, if you haven't seen it, 3 damage for 3 mana. Ideally, however, this should cost you only 1 if you control a wizard. The Lava Runner and the Viashino Pyromancer are wizards, so you have 8 wizards in the deck, so this should only be a 1 mana 3 damage spell. Next, same thing with the Skewer the Critics. Skewer the Critics deals 3 damage to any target. However, if you pay the Spectacle cost, which means if they lost life this turn, then you only have to pay 1 mana for this. Same thing, it's just slower Lightning Bolt basically because it's sorcery speed, but try to make sure that you tap your Thermal Alchemist first so you can trigger off the Spectacle ability, which allows you to then skewer for 1 mana. Finally, the same thing with the Light Up Stage. This is also part of your pseudo card draw to help refuel you. You only be able to exile 2 cards from your library, and you can only have them available until the end of your next turn. So use them if you need to, but same thing like I mentioned with the Spectacle. Ideally, if you have the Thermal Alchemist out, tap it to then only make this cost 1 so you can save your mana for other burn spells to throw to your opponent's face. And then the other card, which is going to be a little spicy for me, that also I did find success with, I actually did make this work, Satyr's Cunning. It's a sorcery that allows you to create a 1/1 red satyr creature token, where even though the creature can't block, you can escape this from the graveyard and by exiling 2 cards as well as pay 3 additional mana. There have been some times where you might actually play this deck and you might end up flooding out, believe it or not. And in those times, a single copy of Satyr's Cunning has actually been very helpful to me. There have been times where I've been able to pull out this card by constantly casting it from the graveyard and then throwing out extra satyrs. Even though they can't block, we can at least try to keep pushing damage to ensure that we can get closer to victory. And since this is a sorcery, this also pings off with things such as the Thermal Alchemist. So don't be afraid to cast these a couple of times if you need to either speed up the clock, or maybe if your opponent is trying to exile stuff from your graveyard, you can then keep refueling from the graveyard extra cards and make them useful for making more satyrs. All right, and that's pretty much it for the deck itself. We're now going to cover the sideboard very quickly as well. All right, so we have now here the sideboard. So again, the sideboard is going to be very flexible depending on what you are planning to do as you go through the ranks, or if you're just playing this casually, you might not have to worry too much. But right now I have a little bit of everything to catch all based on the current format. Don't be afraid to adjust this as things change in the meta. So right now we have 2 red cap melee in the sideboard, 2 abrade, 2 fry, 2 lava coil, 4 young pyromancer, and 3 Tybalt Rakdish Instigator. So first off with the red cap melee, 2 of in the deck that just hits either a creature or planeswalker. If it's non-red, you have to sacrifice a land. There are going to be times where you might have to sacrifice a land to make this work in a pinch against something like Questing Beast. But more likely than not, again, you'll bring this in versus the mirror match or the aggro red decks. Abrade, there's a lot of artifact stuff going on currently in the format, so you might want to actually sideboard in a little bit more of these. But for now, 2 is what I'm going to go with. It's flexible because if you can't destroy an artifact, it can still hit a creature. Fry is going to be more towards the control decks out there that are using things like Teferi, so we want to be able to hit those and prevent them from being countered. So that's why I'm using only 2 Fry in the deck, although recently we haven't run into too many counter and control heavy decks out there, so you might be able to actually get away with maybe just 1 Fry. Again, it really just depends on how the meta is shaping up. And speaking of that, finally Lava Coil. Some people argue that Scorching Dragonfire, which does 3 damage to a creature or a planeswalker and can exile them at instant speed, is better than Lava Coil, but sometimes that 1 extra point of damage makes a big difference. Considering that our deck is already heavy on burn, that is very flexible in how it's being used, this is the reason why I picked Lava Coil, because it has a very specific purpose of getting rid of a card by exiling it as well. And then in those instances where, say, sometimes your Chandra Pyreling can't get through because they have so many chump blockers that can keep preventing you from putting damage all the way, that's why you can sideboard those out and put in Young Pyromancer. So whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you create a 1/1 elemental creature token. So if you have to go wide, you can then swap strategies and try to pull off this combo instead. It does work. I've made it successful a couple of times, but again, it's really very dependent on the matchup. So don't throw these in just because. You want to stick to your main focus of, again, burning out your opponent and then using this as a secondary win condition, similar to the Pyreling. Finally, with Tybalt, it's an uncommon planeswalker, but the main reason why we have it in the sideboard is your opponents can't gain life. So against those life gain heavy decks, which is our biggest weakness as a burn deck, you want to have a way of shutting down their life gain, and this is your only option for that in a budget format. So the other sweet thing about it is we can create a couple of devil creature tokens, and when they die, they deal 1 damage to any target. Sometimes you can help them chump block and then pick off another weakened creature, or sometimes that 1 point of damage can go to face, which can trigger off again the Pyreling and then help us also cast our Skewer the Critics, or maybe even a Light Up the Stage for extra value. Finally, for the deck tech, I didn't mention this, but I'm going to touch upon it very quickly. Because we are budget and because we're a monocolor, really easy, 15 mountains, that's all you need. And then 4 Ramanop Ruins. The Ramanop Ruins also help us make sure that we can get to our goal of actually wrapping up the game. There have been moments where if you do flood out, sometimes sacrificing that desert for 4 mana and tapping this allows you to just close it out. Keep in mind that as you are tapping this for the 2 damage to each opponent ability, you can sacrifice the same desert that you just tapped to make the mana for this ability. So just keep that in mind as well. And with that, that pretty much wraps up the deck tech for us. Again, I'm going to do real quick of a match with Sparky, and then we'll just show you very basically what the deck is trying to do. Nothing fancy. And then from there, finally, I'm going to go over the upgrade path. Okay, and here we are, and we're going to face off against Sparky. The only reason why I want to use Sparky is this way I can explain a couple of basic things as we're playing the deck. So, if you have an opening hand, what you ideally want to have is at least one of your early threats. Ideally, try to have one of your finishers and a handful of burn spells. As you can see right here, we only have 1 land, but again, we are running only 19 lands in the deck, 2 more if you're counting the flipped land that is also a spell. We're going to still keep this just because, with the reason being is our Lava Runner can also still make these spells cheaper. So let's go ahead, let's keep this, and then we're going to just play it just as a test run, just to show you guys again what we're trying to do here. So Lava Runner comes down. That's what you want to do for the first mode. Great, we got our next mountain. Throw it down. Since, again, we're just testing this out, let's try to put this Pyreling out, get in some damage early on, and then we're basically going to be set up now to pull off what we want to do. Okay, Sparky's doing his thing. So we won't be able to get through damage with what we have now. We also have the Thermal Alchemist, so let's just play this out as if we're trying to run under perfect conditions. No attacks right now. Okay, Sparky's going to do its fun things as it normally likes to do. I honestly felt, ooh, see, Rapid Bite. See, So looks like Sparky actually does know some strategies. All right, I'm assuming Sparky might actually have another pump spell, so let's pretend they have that, and instead we'll just allow them to hurt us here. All right, our turn. Okay, so now that you have the Thermal Alchemist and the Pyroling out, this is where the fun can begin. So even though we don't have much mana, we can still tap first, triggers the Pyroling, so now it does 2. We also have Skewer the Critics to get the next point of damage. In an instance like this, since it's also a tapped creature, don't worry about taking out the creatures, just focus on getting in as much damage as possible now. So, tap again. They're down to 14. Pyroling is now pumped up a little bit more. Go to their face again. Shock them. Pyroling pumps itself up again. Thermal Alchemist one more time. Pumps up the Pyroling once again. We go swinging. Remember, this is double strike as well. So I'm sorry to say, Sparky, you are done. And that was only with 2 mana. Again, this is just a test run, but this is ideally what you're trying to do with the deck. So with that, that's pretty much it for the demonstration. Again, I'm trying to show you how you want to make this deck work. That's, of course, under perfect conditions. Now, as far as upgrades to this deck, I'm going to label right here, as you can see on screen, just a couple of cards you may want to consider for the deck. I'm not saying put every single one of these cards in. It really just depends on what your budget is and where you're trying to take the deck. So, for the 1-drop slot, you may want to consider replacing, if you want to keep going with this style of play, to remove the Lava Runner for a Soulscar Mage. Soulscar Mage is an upgrade mainly because, again, its prowess ability allows it to pump itself even higher when you are casting off your burn spells, and this also will make it stronger to swing in for more damage. At the same time, there's going to be moments where you might want to hit an opponent with one of your burn spells, but the difference with this card is it'll put -1/-1 counters on those creatures instead, which can technically weaken a lot of your bigger hitters that you have to normally fight against and make them much more manageable for your deck to sponge. As far as replacing possibly something in the 2-drop slot, you actually could replace one of your burn spells or one of your other creatures like the Pyroling with Bonecrusher Giant, because this one counts as actually a 2-for-1. As you see, Stomp will do 2 damage, but the main thing about that is the damage can't be prevented. So, since it does trigger off for all your burn spells, once you do a Stomp and you're successful at hitting whatever you're targeting, then every one of your burn spells beyond that cannot be stopped, which is very, very helpful for a burn deck in order to ensure that they can make all of their spells connect. Finally, also is very helpful because it's also a 4/3 creature, so that body's actually pretty nice. And its small little effect of being able to deal 2 damage if it gets targeted by a spell is also just an extra cherry on top of this already sweet card. Rampaging Ferocidon is going to be probably what you want to consider in the sideboard slot to replace Tybalt if you want to. However, it really just depends on what kind of meta we're in. Sometimes the Planeswalker might be more better because it's harder to get rid of. Other times the Ferocidon is better because it is a creature and you can start pinging everything. As it says right here, neither player can gain life, but our deck doesn't really worry about life gain, so that's not an issue for us. Its bigger thing, of course, is for creature heavy decks such as White Weenies or Elves decks, this is able to ping our opponent for 1 damage for each creature that comes out onto the field. So this can prevent our opponent from trying to stack up and go wide and punishes them for that. Hazoret the Fervent can be one of our sideboard techs, but you could consider putting it into the main board. As I mentioned, with burn decks, we are throwing everything at our opponent, so usually we end up empty-handed. Hazoret is able to do is able to hit for a lot of damage as long as we have 1 or fewer cards in hand. If we have to get rid of cards we don't need, such as extra lands, you can use its secondary ability, which allows us to discard a card and deal 2 damage to each opponent. So this card can be a great finisher if we need something out on the field to block against bigger stuff. Also because not only does it have haste, but it's also indestructible. So this makes it very hard for our opponent to deal with. A couple other cards also I would consider would be Chandra's Incinerator. This one's a little bit trickier to do, so you might have to actually rethink how you want to do your burn deck. But ideally, as you see, a 6/6 body for 6 may seem expensive in this deck that only runs 19 lands, but it is cheaper to cast, where the X is the total amount of non-combat damage dealt to your opponents this turn. What that basically means is, say like you ping off with your Thermal Alchemist, then you skewer the critics, you've done 4 damage, now the Incinerator only comes in for 2 mana. So this makes it a much more harder body to get rid of at that level, but the other benefit is, of course, you're ideally going to cast this for a much cheaper cost than what it looks like. Also, as you see from its secondary ability, whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, the Incinerator can deal that much damage to a creature or planeswalker that player controls. So what's sweet about this is, once it's on the field, You can now have to only focus on burning out your opponent, and it could still ping off the rest of your opponent's creatures, which makes it much more easier for your creatures to push through the remaining damage. The final card also here is Leyline of Combustion. As it says right here, if Leyline of Combustion is in your opening hand, you can begin with it on the field and you don't have to pay anything. Also, its secondary ability is whenever you and or at least one permanent you control becomes the target of a spell or ability your opponent controls, you deal 2 damage to that player. This card, and I've actually shown this on stream, is actually a really good card that punishes the sacrifice decks that keep targeting us. So then we keep hitting them back for 2 damage, while sometimes they ping us with maybe a Mayhem Devil for 1 damage. So don't underestimate this. I also like using this card to pull in also versus the control decks. And with that, that's pretty much it for our deck tech. So what do you guys think about that? Did I go over everything that you guys feel worked well for this? If not, be sure to let me know in the comments below. I'm more than happy to hear any feedback. If you like this style of deck tech, I'll be more than happy to do more of these. I'm going to try to plan to do these on every Tuesday, and on every Thursday, again, we're going to be doing more in-depth stuff in Arena in general. So thanks again for watching, guys. Be sure to like and subscribe if I helped you out or at least entertained you. And until next time, when in doubt, jank 'em out. Later.